Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war update extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where am I going to go to first? Well, I am going to go to having an argument with one of my commenters because, hey, I love doing it. No, this isn't just me picking a little spat, having a public spat with someone, um, but it's not just about defending myself. It's actually about, well, what can we learn from this, and is there some knowledge that I can impart to you that might be useful and might be somewhat accurate, hopefully. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the T-54 and T-55 tanks that have apparently are being brought out of long-term mothballing and are being sent either to the front line or to be dismantled. Now, if they're being sent to the front line, there are lots of theories about how they might be used, given that these are really, really old tanks. I was just doing a video yesterday, which was an extra on thinking about what a counteroffensive might look like, and I drew on a couple of comments from previous threads from other commenters who put a couple of their theories forward. And here is Defective putting a theory forward. I then add to it and use the word howitzer, but he didn't use that, so that's worth knowing. But this argument is going to be about how to use the T-54s and 55s and to use them in a non-battle tank kind of way. So let's go back to the source material. As such, Russian commanders, will be looking to heavily defend this area. My assessment of the deployment of the T-55 and 54 tanks is that they would be deployed as direct fire, indirect fire pillboxes along heavily mined and fortified defensive lines leading towards the Azov coast. It's a really good point, something Perun mentioned in his video, saying don't take the mickey out of using these tanks. These are basically guns and they could just be used essentially as howitzers. They still have, decent enough guns. I'm happy to explain how this would work if desired, but it sounds pretty straightforward to me. And actually, he doesn't talk about using them as howitzers, but more like direct fire, which means you can see what you're firing at. So it's kind of like a pillbox that can't move, that's maybe in a revetment, shooting over a heavily mined area as you've got people advancing towards you, or maybe slightly indirect, but not like as much as a howitzer. I was one that mentioned howitzer, but for good reason. Anyway, I was called out by a commenter for discussing this and for being, incredibly ignorant. So here is what they say. Am I feel lonely with half a brain, or I'm not quite sure whether English is their first language, or knows how a tank. So am I the only person with half a brain or knows how a tank or artillery piece works? You guys, a tank and howitzer are so insanely vastly different. It's not even close to ever being used as either or as a substitute. You cannot aim a tank like a howitzer. The freaking thing is measured in mils. It's mil spec. A tank, especially from the 40s, you're aiming like a gun. With a howitzer, you're given a coordinate and there's a simple equation depending on what the round barrel elevation, and you fire, then adjust, and you can hit a target after a few tries. A tank is like firing a rifle in the air and hoping it falls on the target. Even if you get close, there's no way to adjust your accuracy, as a single mil at a few thousand yards could send your shell hundreds of meters, lowest number, in another direction, all of which would give away your position trying to hit your target. These tanks will only have a single function, and because a sitting tank is worthless and just a target, no matter what you say to otherwise, its only use would be used during defensive fighting or strategic retreat alongside other tanks, being used as support for maneuvers as such, but with others and or combined arms. Alone, they are useless no matter what you say. They can be taken out so easily by infantry, even if they are even more useless as an artillery piece. I don't know how anyone could come up with this idea. You can report on combat and wars with no knowledge of the subject, but that's all you can do. Report what's already being said. Please do not give any of your own 2 cents on subjects you have absolutely no clue on, because it sticks, and soon all these people and channels start repeating this crap, and then it somehow becomes fact. I like to watch other channels because there are always people with different expertise who can give their analysis and breakdown on it, but when they start talking about other things they have no clue about in the same video or sentence, it just takes away any credibility of them, and any credibility of them in the future videos, making it impossible to take anything said without cringing and without a mountain of salt, not a grain. Okay, so this guy has absolutely taken me to task over this. The question is, This is not like, am I right or am I wrong, right? The question is, let's talk about the subject. Can the tanks be used in this way? Which is okay. So tanks only have a certain amount of elevation on their turrets, so they are the barrels, so they are unable to get to the angled elevation you need for a howitzer. So can you use them as a howitzer? And am I just talking absolute nonsense? Well, what's interesting is Perun discussed this as a war analyst. Now I don't know his expertise on war and pieces of equipment actually, so he might be talking ignorantly. But he, in a very well viewed video, has talked about using them in this way. Now, some people know of Willie OAM. I believe he's a former crew commander in Afghanistan. He came back because of a brain. Has he got a brain tumor? I think so. He's not enlisted anymore. But here he talks about it in his video from yesterday.
Now, these tanks absolutely will not stand up to a Challenger 2, an Abrams, a Leopard. But my thinking is they're not going to be used for that. They're going to be used as makeshift artillery in defensive positions. As Russia know, and they've talked about a lot, that Ukraine is going to go on the offensive soon. And at the end of the day, yes, it's old. Yes, it's 70, 80 years old. The gun on it is from, really dates back to World War II, although we have a lot of weapons in the Western Army that date back that far as well. But at the end of the day, it is still a maneuverable armoured box with a large gun on it. And it's going to need a very expensive and close range, at least by person, anti-armoured weapon to take that out. And this is still a formidable challenge on the battlefield for any ground troops, and Russia has these tanks in massive numbers. And this is
so he's talking about using them as artillery. Okay, so I'm not on my own, so it's not just me. Right, let's go and look at, here is, like, this has happened. So let's see if actually such a thing happens. Well, here's a video going back to the Korean War of a tank being used as a howitzer, and this is a tank from broadly the same era. So this is an M26 Pershing tank in indirect fire role in Korea on August the 24th, 1950. So what they do is they have to build because it can't get the turret or the barrel up to the correct angle, you need to angle the whole tank in order to allow that to happen. So you build some kind of angled revetment or what have you that allows the tank to be shot in this role. Now, I never said this was going to be a good use of the tank. I never said it would be good artillery. I never put any kind of qualification of as to, or any value judgment as to how successful a kind of form of artillery this would be. Just that could be what the Russians decide to do. So here we have Americans doing this. And you can go and watch a video. So apart from their primary role providing direct fire, tanks can also be called upon to provide indirect fire support as ad hoc artillery. As their gun elevation is limited in order to give the vehicle a lower profile, they can increase their firing angle and therefore range by firing from a ramp. This is demonstrated in this footage by tanks of the 89th Heavy Tank Battalion in Korea. The shells are not ideal because fired from the high-velocity tank gun, they need to be thick-walled to withstand barrel acceleration, and this leaves less room for explosive filler. That said, the M71HE shell, presumably being fired here, still carried a filler of almost 1 kilogram, about the same as an 81mm mortar round. Elevated in this manner, the M26 could fire such a projectile over 15 kilometers, outranging the contemporary standard 105mm howitzer by a considerable margin. By using a proximity fuse, the shells could be set to burst at a predetermined distance from the ground, making them much more effective against targets in the open compared to shell that buried itself in the ground before detonating. So we have precedents for this. Okay, now let's look at a Forbes article. Russia's ancient T-55 tanks could double as artillery, but not very good artillery. Again, it's not about how good this is supposed to be, it's about whether Russia could use them as such, which is all I was saying. Okay, those 70-year-old T-54 and 55 tanks that the Russian army is pulling out of a long-term storage, possibly in order to recondition them for frontline use in Ukraine, wouldn't last long in direct fight with the Ukrainian army's own tanks. So the point here is that if Russia are bringing these to the front line, now I don't know whether they definitely are. I don't know whether these are going to be dismantled and not brought to the front line. But if they are going to be brought to the front line, they've been brought to the front line for a reason, right? They've got a gun and they are armored. So the assumption is they're going to use that gun. Otherwise, they might as well bring an APC right? Or a jeep or something. It's an armored gun, so they are going to use it as an armored gun, right? That to me seems like a pretty sensible assumption. So how are you going to use it as an armored gun? Are you going to send it against all these tanks? No, because they'll get absolutely destroyed before they get close. So, well, then what are you going to do? What he talked about, Coach Trevor there talked about maybe using defensively. Yeah, that is perfectly plausible, of course. Could they be used as artillery? Yeah. Like if you can get if they had these in huge numbers, and you wouldn't need to use full crew because you're just going to set them into a single place where they're just going to sit there, and they've got a lot of ammunition for these things, then you can set these up and arguably, with fewer crew in them, and fire off these rounds to get a fairly decent range. So this article continues, but tank-on-tank combat might not be what the Russians have in mind for the 40-ton T-54-55s with their 4 crew, up to 800 horsepower engines and 100mm rifled main guns. The Russian army could deploy the ancient tanks not as tanks per se, but as artillery. Angle their guns high and fire 35-pound high explosive shells as far as 10 miles. The T-55 is a poor substitute for a purpose-built howitzer, yes, which might fire twice as far as a tank can do, more accurately, faster, and for longer. But in a war where both sides are desperately short of artillery and artillery ammunition, an obsolete 70-year-old tank lobbing less in-demand ammunition a modest distance might be somewhat better than nothing. Emphasis on somewhat. Okay, so they have loads of ammunition for this. They've got loads of these tanks. They don't have loads of ammunition for their artillery, and they could even be struggling for artillery pieces at the moment. I've been talking about that recently. So there is a plausibility here. There's ample precedent, and this is super important, for tanks as artillery in the Ukraine war and other conflicts. So if he's saying that this is ridiculous, I don't know what I'm talking about. This has actually already been done in the Ukraine war. The Ukrainian army, sorry, I'm getting into rant mode. The Ukrainian army has compensated for a dearth of howitzers by drilling indirect fire techniques into the 3-person crews of its locally made T-64 tanks. The Russian army lately has done the same, even with its best T-90s. And in the bloody month-long territorial war between Armenia and Azerbaijan back in 2020, the Azeris deployed at least a company with a dozen T-55 tanks, apparently near the disputed district of Akdam, and apparently as howitzers, hyperlinked there. So not only do we have precedents in this war, we have precedents in a very recent war just 3 years ago of using T-55 tanks in this way. Newer T-72s handled direct assaults on Armenian positions. The Russians could borrow from the Azeris' experience. It's important to remember that a tank, in essence, is a big gun on a rotating mount, wrapped in armor and traveling on a chassis. In the T-54-55's case, the gun is a D-10T, a derivative of the D-10 anti-tank gun that entered service with the Soviet Army in 1944. They are using D-10s in this conflict. I believe both sides may even be using D10s. The 54 caliber gun has a muzzle velocity of 3,300 feet per second, pretty good by World War II standards. On a typical vehicle mount, the gun can elevate as high as 18 degrees. That's low compared to a purpose-built howitzer. The Soviet S2S1, for instance, elevates as high as 70 degrees. The low elevation obviously limits the D10T's range, while firing indirectly at targets beyond visual range. Another limitation is that the D-10's ammunition, like all modern tank ammo, is fixed. That is, it includes a warhead and charge in a single pre-made unit. In contrast to an artillery crew, a tank crew can't add powder bags to the charge to boost its firing range. I believe that's what they do in the Challenger 2. My Challenger, I was speaking to a Challenger 2 tank commander at the weekend, who's a dad of one of the boys in my my boys' rugby team. And we're having a chat about this, and he was talking about the powder charge bags. But anyway, I could be wrong. But this article author doesn't talk about actually putting the tank at an angle, which we know can be done and has been done. When fitted to a tank, the D10T pairs with the gunner's sight, the TSH-222, on many T-54s and 55. The sight's range reticle only goes as high as 6,000 meters or so. That's 6,600 yards for the furthest firing high explosive shell. So a T-54-55 crew fighting as artillery gunners would need outside help while aiming at targets near the D-10T's theoretical maximum range at more than 17,000 yards. Accuracy could suffer. Well, yeah. Finally, tank ammunition and tank guns aren't designed for the fast, repetitive combat tempo, load, fire for hours on end. That's typical for howitzers. True artillery barrels are built to last. Tank gun barrels, on the other hand, tend to overheat, droop, and lose accuracy with hard use. So the T-54-55 can double as artillery, but only as an expedient. As improvised howitzers, the tank's D10 T guns lack range, accuracy, and durability, but assigning the obsolete tanks with their antiquated guns to an indirect fire role is the healthier choice for their crews. That's the point. Sending them into direct combat, especially against Ukrainian tanks, would only get them destroyed and their crews potentially captured, hurt, or killed. And then, if you don't trust that guy as not being military enough, even though he's provided the details that you really need there, Russia sends old T-54-55 tanks to Ukraine to replace loss of modern tanks. This is in armyrecognition.com. And there's just a couple of paragraphs that talk about the T-54-55 can be used effectively as in asymmetric warfare scenarios such as guerrilla warfare or urban combat, where its limitations may be less apparent. In these environments, the T-54 can provide valuable fire support for infantry and serve as a mobile defensive platform. Using the T-54-55 in defensive roles such as static fortifications or ambush tactics can help maximize its survivability and firepower. By leveraging the tank's armor and firepower in well-prepared defensive positions, the T-54-55 can still pose a threat to more modern adversaries. Now, I don't know whether defensive positions would mean something like an angled revetment, or whether this is just hiding it around a building in case the troops attack. But there's a level of interpretation there. But the point is that the point is that this guy's accusations are at least somewhat inaccurate, because A, tanks have been used as artillery in this conflict already. B, T-55s and 55s have been used as artillery in the Azerbaijan conflict only 3 years ago in exactly that way. Also, the American tanks are being used in that way, and there's video evidence of that happening. And other experts have been talking about how this is plausible and a really distinct possibility for the Ukrainians, including, in this case, a Forbes article and a former crew member themselves. So, in summary, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, in summary, I feel vindicated by that. I don't think I'm wrong, but more importantly, here is some data points, but also some rationale for the Russians using these vehicles in that way. And if we see that, this is something that won't be completely unexpected. We've talked about this. This could well be a really distinct possibility. Defective answers as well, because he was a bit taken aback. You're 100% correct that tanks make terrible artillery, but that isn't what he suggested. So I was the one that mentioned howitzers. He suggested using them in direct and indirect capacities. Artillery is only one form of indirect fire. Tanks can serve fire missions like artillery can. They can't reach the ranges artillery can, etc. But if you have a team of specialists set a tank in place and then do the ballistic calculations on pen and paper for at which angle of elevation and what direction the tank would need to fire to hit specified strategic locations, which are within range but out of sight, then you can serve fire missions on those locations. You would then put 2 or 3 guys. You have 45 minutes of training into them, as in reality they are eventual death traps, so you don't want to risk your good crews, and tell them that if somebody calls on a radio and says shoot at spot X, then you aim the gun as shown on the sheet of paper taped into the inside of the tank and fire the rounds. You would also do the same for targets in a direct line of sight, set up pre-sighted target points and have a specialized team work out the ballistics, and then tell the crew to aim at Y target point, etc. In other words, he had a slightly different idea, but basically these are death traps, so you put your poorly trained crew in, that they only have to do this one particular thing, which is fire this gun at the point that we tell you to, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's my little defense of my position over. Let me know if you think that A, that was worthwhile, B, what your thoughts on that are. Okay, David D says something about Russian manpower. I don't think English is his first language, so bear with me as I read through it. So Argument winner. So the quote is, Russia has 3 times the manpower that Ukraine, so therefore they will win. His answer is Russia has far more troops in the police and internal security than in the army. And I've told you this before, right from the beginning of the war. This is the problem with expecting the Russian public to get up in arms and protest against the war. There are more internal security members working inside Russia than soldiers in their armed forces. Russia has far more of those kind of troops, police and internal security, than in the army. Without them, Putin cannot stay in power. They also need far more manpower just to operate the Russian Federation. Russia has 20 times the landmass than Ukraine. It has to be protected, defended, and policed. For Russia to use the manpower, he would have to strip both leaving the people to starve and riot. A win for Ukraine. Officially, it's 350,000, but really close to 500,000. Just a few now in Ukraine. That's a big drain on manpower. Officially, there are over 600,000 in the Russian police force. Again, cannot really be stripped from Russia for fear of civil unrest. The latest data showed that approximately 600,000 policemen operated in the country in 2017, as according to Wikipedia. Add to that 150,000 in FSB and border guards. That again are mostly not in Ukraine. So for the total, so what he's trying to do is saying, right, if you've got a pool of Russian men, and you say, right, well, look at the size of the population of Russia. They can easily sustain these kind of losses or this kind of mobilization into the armed forces to be sent to Ukraine. It's like, well, actually, it's more difficult than you think, because out of that pool of humans, some of those, a lot of them, are ring fenced. The sort of ones you might want in the army are actually in the police force, in the FSB, or in the border guards, and so on and so forth. So of that total, that's over 1.3 million that cannot be touched by the military for the Ukrainian operations. Another 1.1 to 1.4 million cannot be used from the military, air defense, rocket forces, navy, air force, etc. They are in strategic forces that do not shoot rifles. So not only can you not take from this pool of people, but the people already in the army that you're kind of not taking into account. So when you're talking about X million people, well, actually, there's already 1.1 to 1.4 million of those serving in armies, in the army or in the armed forces or navy, in strategic positions that can't be sent to the front line or to Ukraine, that are doing other things. So yes, you have a larger population, but are starving for troops that they can use in Ukraine, and of course take also into account that you've had 1 million plus people escaping from Russia, so that they're not drawn into the conflict themselves. So that's a really good point. I think there that it's easy to think Russia have just got this pool of people that they can just dip into, and it's almost an endless pool of people, and they would have no problem dipping into that. But actually, it is more nuanced than that. Okay, this is another bit of sort of propaganda stuff. The faces in this. So what she says here, unfortunately, I don't want to spoil anyone's mood, but there are no power outages in Kyiv anymore. Ukrainians do not sit without electricity. I love the sad music here, as if like this is, oh, how sad for the Russians. Obviously, she's saying a lot more than that. So this is the idea here is that, oh, how sad it is that the Ukrainians don't have electricity. That was one of their intentions with the energy infrastructure. Missile hits. It's like, what? Imagine sitting there and going, oh, you know that country that we've attacked, that we've invaded? God damn it, I can't believe those civilians have got electricity. I can't believe they're not freezing in their houses. Oh, God, it's so awful. Why aren't they freezing to death? Oh, I wish those civilians would just freeze to death in their houses. Why do they have to have electricity? Why do they have to be able to live their lives? Oh, my goodness. It turns out you're an absolute moral monster. Yeah, thanks for that, TV propagandist. Yeah, pretty awful. So this is the first evidence of a tow being used, as far as I know. This one's on a Humvee. So these are ATGMs that are connected. You have to have line of sight, and they have a wire that comes out of them. But we talked about that in one of the Thomas C. Tyner videos recently. I don't know if this one's got music. Yes, it will have music, but I might have to mute it in a second. So here we have a Humvee setting up before they get near the target. So it's not like they're drilling up to the target and then set up the tow. But this is him getting on the Hummer, putting the ATGM in its brackets. And so, right, let's go for it. And they rock on. And the old Hummer wags its tail. And that's the tow missile doing its damage. He's happy. He starts shouting and hollering. Success. So these are the ATGMs are on top of the Bradleys. There are different tows. So it's worth knowing what one that is. But anyway, that's the first usage of that in Ukraine, as far as I know. I'm now going to play you the end of the video I did yesterday, but it's too long, so I cut it off. But it's to do with the economics of Russia and looking through a Wall Street Journal article. And at the end of that, I say my goodbyes and say I might do a short video. I actually did that video yesterday anyway, so there will be no other video, I don't think, today. But anyway, check that out. Stay with me. Over to economics. Okay, let's go on to talk about the economy. I promised I would. I threatened you were talking about this. Now, unfortunately, I can't highlight this article. It won't let me highlight it for some reason. I'm going to have to remember parts to pick out. Russia's economy is starting to come undone, says the Wall Street Journal. Investment is down, labor is scarce, budget is squeezed. Oligarch says there will be no money next year. Country's biggest exports, gas and oil, have lost major customers. Government finances are strained. The ruble is down over 20% since November against the dollar. The labor force has shrunk as young people are sent to the front to flee the country over fears of being drafted. Uncertainty has curbed business investment. Russia's economy is entering a long-term regression, predicted Alexandra Prokopenko, a former Russian central bank official who left the country shortly after the invasion. There is no sign the economic difficulties are bad enough to pose a short-term threat to Russia's ability to wage war, but state revenue shortfalls suggest an intensifying dilemma over how to reconcile ballooning military expenditures with the subsidies and social spending that have helped President Putin shield civilians from hardship. Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska warned this month that Russia is running out of cash. Quote, there will be no money next year. We need foreign investors, the raw materials magnate said at an economic conference. Of course, they're losing investors from Europe, from the US. It is, you've had massive companies like BP pull out. They surely will be struggling. Despite Russia's resilience in the short term, the long-term picture is bleak. Moscow will be much more inward-looking and overly dependent on China, says one expert. They are indeed, as I said the other day, a vassal of China, a vassal state. A big part of the dimming outlook stems from the bad bet by Mr. Putin last year that he could use Russian energy supplies to limit Western Europe's support for Ukraine. Of course, that never happened. We had a warm winter. We didn't need energy as much. And we managed to wean ourselves off Russian energy really amazingly quickly in Europe. European governments, instead of tempering their support for Kyiv, moved rapidly to find new sources of natural gas and oil. Most Russian gas flows to Europe stopped, and after an initial jump, global gas prices fell sharply. Moscow now says it will cut its oil production by 5% until June from its previous level. It is selling its oil at a discount to global prices. As a result, the government's energy revenue fell by nearly half in the first 2 months of this year compared to last year, while the budget deficit deepened. Nearly a half. I mean, this was a massive amount of money they were getting last year. and they are getting around about half of that now. The fiscal gap hit $34 billion in the first 2 months, the equivalent of more than 1.5% of the country's total economic output. That is forcing Moscow to dip deeper into its sovereign wealth fund, one of its main anti-crisis buffers. The government can still borrow domestically, and the sovereign wealth fund still has 147 billion, even after shrinking by 28 billion since before the invasion. Russia has found ways to sell its oil to China and India. China has stepped up to provide many parts Russia used to get from the West. So this is, parts in manufacturing all sorts of things, and one presumes, I wonder about, oil production, because with the pulling out Western companies from Russian oil production, they are struggling to be able to extract the oil and use the equipment effectively. They can't replace parts. There are some people worried that actually things would go wrong, and they would be unable to pump oil or stop it pumping, and all sorts of different things. And also, this affects the cost of extraction. So the cost now for Russia to extract that oil is far higher than it was previously. As we continue later, for much of Putin's more than 20 years in charge, high oil and gas revenue underpinned a social contract that saw most Russians largely staying out of opposition politics and protests in exchange for rising living standards. The IMF has estimated that Russia's potential growth rate, the rate at which it could grow without courting inflation, was around 3.5% before 2014, the year it seized Crimea from Ukraine. That has now fallen to around 1%, some economists say, as productivity declines and the economy becomes technologically backward and more isolated. For an economy like Russia, 1% is nothing. It's not even a maintenance level, said Ms. Prokopenko, the former central bank official. And then as we go, so let's have a look at a few of these. Oil and gas revenue, you can see going up as they were getting lots of money for it, as prices rose, and then as Europe weaned themselves off, and then winter came along, and then again back down, they are not making the money they would like. The federal budget balance is not looking great there in terms of trillions of rubles. They are in the negative. Retail trade turnover index, so there's not a lot of business being done in Russia. There's not a lot of people buying stuff. There's which you need to stimulate the economy. So this looks, rather like the sort of graphs you would see around a recession. The fall in exports, tight labour market, and increased government spending and worsening inflation risks, the central bank said this month, are worsening inflation risks. Russia's inflation was running at around 11% in February, compared with that month last year. That rate will temporarily fall below 4% in the coming months, the central bank said, though that is because of a high comparison base of the post-invasion surge in prices last year. A number of other economic indicators will also temporarily improve in the coming months due to such base effects, economists say. That's masking the true reality, is the implication here. The country's industry is in its worst labour crunch since records began in 1993. The Moscow-based Gaidar Institute for Economic Policy has said the post-invasion brain drain and last fall's 300,000-man military mobilisation have resulted in around half of businesses facing worker shortages, according to the central bank. Locksmiths, welders and machine operators are in high demand. On a recent visit to an aircraft factory, Mr. Putin said the labour shortage is hampering military production. He said that the government has prepared a list of priority professions for deferment from service. It's just not looking good. Just wondering if there's anything else to pull from this article. So the car industry's been hit, the air industry's been really hit. Companies are adapting to the West's import bans, while Moscow has boosted imports of technologies critical to its war in Ukraine from other countries, including semiconductors and microchips from China. In many civilian sectors, parts are difficult to replace. Russia has tried import substitution, replacing foreign goods with homemade ones for years, before the current sanctions with limited success. A large chunk of its telecommunications equipment and advanced oil drilling software is imported. This is a little bit like going back to Soviet times, doing everything ourselves, said an economist. It will be nearly impossible to properly replace what's missing. Analysts at the central bank have called the post-war reality reverse industrialization, suggesting a reliance on less sophisticated technology, which is fascinating. While official statistics don't break out military production, the output of finished metal goods, a line that analysts say includes weapons and ammunition, rose by 7% last year. So they are producing more stuff, but actually that's in the sector that includes finished metal goods, which is, your war stuff. Military industrial complex. Production of computers, electronic and optical products, and another line said to include military output rose by 2% for the year and 41% in December compared with November. By contrast, auto output fell by 45% year over year. Military production masks the problems. Quote, "This isn't real productive growth. This doesn't help the economy," Ms. Prokopenko said. So Russia managed to avoid the worst last year, aided initially by high global energy prices. Gross domestic product fell 2.1%, according to official data. And people like Jeffrey Sonnenfeld have said that no, this official data is not to be trusted. So if they're saying, hey, things are bad, but they're not too bad, actually, pretty all right with what our GDP situation is. Actually, don't trust what they're saying, is what he would say. According to official data, far less than some early forecasts of a 10% to 15% drop. They could have had that, but they could be lying about their stats, is what some are claiming. Gas exports to Europe didn't start trailing off until after summer. The EU's ban on Russian seaborne oil and a group of G7 price cap began to take effect only in December. Sanctions on oil products such as diesel took effect last month. These delays kept energy revenue up and helped the government unleash a huge fiscal stimulus of around 4% of GDP in 2022, according to the IMF. In January and February of this year, however, oil and gas tax revenue, which accounts for nearly half of total budget revenue, right? Half of their money they get as a government comes from oil and gas revenue, fell by 46% year over year, while state spending jumped more than 50%. So that's to say, so if half of their revenue fell by half, that's a quarter of their revenue. They've suddenly got 25% of their revenue has disappeared. And at the same time, what they're spending has gone up 50%. So our income has reduced 25%, our spending has gone up 50%, and that is going to produce some really bad looking books. Analysts estimate that Russia's fiscal break-even oil price that it would need to balance its book has swelled to over $100 a barrel. So they need $100 a barrel at the moment to break even, and that's coming in at the moment at $50 a barrel. $49.56 is what the Urals got in February. And Brent was getting around $80 a barrel. So they're never going to be able to get $100 a barrel. So consumers are ailing too. Retail sales fell 6.7% in 2022, the worst showing since 2015, according to official data. New car sales fell by 62% in February, year on year. And so on and so forth. It's just not looking good. For this year, most analysts expect another fall in GDP, although some, including IMF, forecast modest growth. But the fund said that by 2027, economic output is projected to be around 7% lower than pre-war forecasts had indicated. The loss in human capital, isolation from global financial markets, and impaired access to advanced technology will hamper the Russian economy, said the IMF. And Rystad Energy, a consulting firm, expects investments in Russian oil and gas exploration and production to fall to $33 billion this year from a predicted $57 billion before the invasion. That would mean less output down the line. Analysts at BP estimate that Russia's total oil production, which was around 12 million barrels a day in 2019, will be down to between 7 and 9 million by 2035. We're not talking about a 1 year or 2 year crisis, said Mr. Astrov. The Russian economy will be on a different trajectory. So, yeah, it might not collapse and implode straight away, but there is a long-term malaise there in the economy. And you have just a really serious situation with regard to what they're predicted. So they're budgeted for getting all this income in, and that income isn't coming in. So their entire budgets have to be completely rehashed, and of course that's going to affect what they're spending money on outside of the military industrial complex. Yeah, as it says here, the economy is just becoming more and more dependent on the state. It's producing military equipment, clothing, and all that kind of stuff, but for the war effort. It's not really going to be producing stuff for internal domestic consumption. There's going to be a lack of stimulus. There's going to be a lack of money to spend on education, welfare, hospitals, all this kind of stuff. And this is going to be just well, arguably could be a spiral downwards. It just might be a slower spiral than some people were predicting previously. Anyway, that's just a bit of economic analysis there. Sorry, a bit of a rushed romp through that as I'm already over time. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Please like, subscribe, and share. Hit the bell button. I don't know, all that kind of stuff that you're supposed to do, or YouTubers are supposed to say. I don't know, whatever. Thanks for all your support. Really appreciate it. Take care, and I will speak to you tomorrow or later if I do a little one.